How could an aircraft descend to 6 feet, that's only 183 centimeters over the ground, almost a full mile away from the airport, without the pilots noticing it? The story I'm going to tell you today is based on a very complete interim report by the French authorities, the BEA. Now, the reason I've chosen to use an interim report is because this story highlights some very important safety lessons that I want to share with you guys. When the pilots had finished their pre-flight preparation, they went and they briefed their cabin crew, and then they walked all together out towards the aircraft. The captain checked the technical status of the aircraft, which was found to be perfectly in working order. At this point, there was 2 pilots, 4 cabin crew, and 172 passengers on board the aircraft. The aircraft taxied out normally, and at time 0930 UTC, that's 11:30 local time, took off from runway 08 in Stockholm Arlanda and started climbing towards the southwest towards Paris. When aircraft are flying at higher altitudes, what we refer to as flight levels, we all set the same pressure reference, which is 1013.25 hectopascals. And the reason we're doing that is because when we're at higher levels, we are less interested in knowing exactly how high we are above the sea level, and we're more interested in making sure that all of the aircraft that are flying all around us are using the same pressure reference so that we can maintain the altitude separation between each individual aircraft. But the difference here is that when the EasyJet aircraft reads back the clearance, they said, we'll continue to Papa Golf 650, descending 5,000 feet, QNH 1001. Red Nose 4311 now received their approach clearance. They start to configure their aircraft, they select flaps 1, flaps 2, and at time 11:36:55, the aircraft reaches its final descent point for the RMP approach, runway 27 right, and the aircraft starts descending using the autopilot following the pre-programmed descent path. As they started the descent, the indicated altitude that the pilots could see in the cockpit was about 4,900 feet, but the actual altitude the aircraft was at was 4,623 feet. They were 14.3 nautical miles away from the runway and with a speed of about 180 knots. Another factor that we need to mention here is that as the crew started their approach, a large rain cloud had moved in over the extended center line with quite moderate rain inside of it. This meant that the crew was now completely inside cloud and they had no visual reference neither with the runway nor the ground below them. Because the crew had the incorrect QNH reference pressure set, it meant that the altitude and the altimeters was indicating the correct altitude for each of these distance checks they were doing. But in reality, they were actually 300 feet lower than they thought they were. If this same error would have happened on an ILS approach, the physical location of the ILS glide slope beam would have stayed the same. So no matter what pressure setting the pilots would have set on their altimeters, they would have still locked on to that glide slope beam, which would have brought them down towards the runway. In that case, if they would have done distance versus altitude checks, the error would have been shown very clearly. 11:38 and 9 seconds, the aircraft is handed over to the North Tower Controller in Charles de Gaulle. The first officer calls in and the tower controller greets them and clears the aircraft to land at runway 27 right with a surface wind of 260 degrees at 12 knots. From this point onwards, there are no more calls regarding the pressure setting. The aircraft is still descending through the cloud, but unbeknownst to the crew, the tower controller has forgotten to switch on the approach light system. This will further reduce the chance of the crew establishing visual contact as they get closer. At time 11:38 and 44 seconds, the aircraft's radio altimeter activated and made a call out as it now sensed a height of the ground of 2,500 feet. That should normally happen at about 6.5 miles final, and if that happens earlier than that, that's a clue to the pilots that maybe they are much lower than they should be, and it's a prompt to verify that they have the correct QNH set. The only thing that was out of the ordinary was a lower than normal radio height at the distance they were from the runway, but none of the pilots had picked that up. So the aircraft just continued to descend down its pre-programmed descent path down towards its minima, but now unusual things are starting to happen inside of the tower. The 2 air traffic control towers in Charles de Gaulle Airport are equipped with a warning system called MSAV. It stands for Minimum Safe Altitude Warning. What this system basically does is that it has created a 64 nautical mile square around the airport. Inside of this square, it has modeled all of the different obstacles, and then it has applied a 300 feet safety margin on top of these obstacles. If the system feels that any aircraft within this square is on a trajectory to get into that safety zone and potentially hit an obstacle, it will issue a warning in the tower, both a visual warning and an oral warning calling beep beep terrain alert. At time 11:41 and 32 seconds, the first MSAV warning went off in the tower. The aircraft was then at an indicated altitude of 891 feet, which with the altitude error they were now flying with was actually an altitude of 601 feet. But remember, that's over sea level, and in reality that was a radar height of 200 feet at a distance of 1.53 nautical miles, that's 2.8 kilometers away from the landing threshold. And since the pilots had not established visual contact with the landing runway, the captain now decided to execute a go-around. The aircraft is now 102 feet above the ground at a distance of 1.2 nautical miles away from the landing runway. But remember how I told you that when the pilots start executing the go-around, the aircraft continues to descend for a little bit longer? Yeah, that's happening now as well. So as the pilots are taking the decision to go around and starting to both disconnect the autopilot in this case and pitch up the aircraft continues to descend. And it is at this point that the tower controller finally calls the aircraft and says, Red Nose 4311, I just had a terrain alert. Are you okay? Do you see the runway? The pilots did not hear or respond to this message. They were likely too focused on the go-around that they had just decided to execute. 3 seconds later, as the captain has finished moving the thrust lever into the toga position, the aircraft arrives at its lowest indicated height of 6 feet above the ground. That's 183 centimeters, basically 2 centimeters lower than my full height, at a distance of 0.8 nautical mile from the runway, 1.5 kilometers. That is incredibly low, and it mercifully now starts to climb away. But this story is not finished yet. Remember, they're still not down on the ground. So the aircraft just completed the turn heading north, continued to climb up to 5,000 feet, still on the incorrect pressure setting. The autopilot was engaged and the after takeoff checklist was completed, and the crew started preparing for another RMP approach into the same runway. At the same time, in the North Tower down on Charles de Gaulle Airport, the assistant controller in the South Tower that was taking care of the other runways had noticed that the approach light for runway 27 right had not been activated. He contacted his colleague, the assistant in the North Tower, and told him about this. And when the North Tower controller realized that they had missed switching on the approach light system and that they had had an MSAV warning as well, he was replaced and the assistant took over his place and a new tower assistant was called in. They had no idea how close they had been to the ground. At this point, the aircraft was already maintaining 5,000 feet, which was the initial altitude to start another RMP approach, and during the time they were receiving vectors, there was no more radio communication that was pertaining to the QNH setting. So there was no point from this point onward for the crew to pick up that they once again were sitting with the wrong QNH. Instead, the crew now found themselves in exactly the same position like they had been on the last approach, 300 feet below profile as they initiated the descent. They were still inside of cloud at this point, and they were descending down the cloud path as they were once again handed over to the North Tower controller. At time 11:53 and 40 seconds, the aircraft was once again cleared to land runway 27 right, and this time the first officer called up the tower and asked him to confirm that the approach lighting was actually activated. The tower controller confirmed this. 2 minutes later, the next MSAV warning went off in the tower. But at this point, the rain cloud and the rain shower had finally started moving away from the final approach path. So the aircraft broke through the clouds and became visual with the landing runway. At this point, the pilot also later testified that they saw the poppies as being 2 red, 1 pink and 1 white, indicating that they were almost back on path here. Less than 1 minute later, Norwegian Air Shuttle Flight 4311 landed safely on runway 27 right.